This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast.
When J.D. Vance published his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, in 2016, it spread like wildfire among readers. His memoir about what he describes as an Appalachian childhood in Middletown, Ohio, with a drug-addicted mother and a Kentucky grandmother, whom he mostly credits for making it all the way to Yale Law School, quickly rose to the top of the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there, reaching number 1 in 2017. In 2022, the Netflix adaptation of the book was released, directed by Ron Howard, further pushing Vance's story into the mainstream, especially during a year when everyone was isolating and likely streaming and reading more than ever. The sales reflected what many readers thought about the book. It's a well-told American bootstrap story. The narrator starts out in poverty, in conditions that no kid could overcome, and we watch, cheering him on, as he climbs all the way to the Ivy Leagues in spite of that bleak, impoverished state. But many, many people throughout Appalachia were incensed and had much to say about Vance's book, mostly the parts where he pivots from his personal narrative and tries to broadly explain the problems that plague the region. Especially now that he's the VP nominee, they take issue with his stance as an Appalachian insider who blames the hillbilly for his own problems. We created them, Vance writes, and only we can fix them. This is where his memoir is accused of being a foreshadowing of his political goals and problematic for readers and Appalachian scholars. Blaming Appalachians for exploitation of their resources, exploitation of their pain by drug companies, and failed systems can lead to exploitation of stereotypes that the region has been battling for a century. Blaming people for the region's problems erases accountability by those who truly are responsible, like drug companies, for example, that specifically targeted the region when they began marketing a highly addictive drug. Vance's Appalachia, writes Dwight Billings for Appalachian Reckoning, is refracted through the distorted lens of his own dysfunctional family experience. What resulted was a surge of writing that poured from Appalachia in response to Hillbilly Elegy by people in the region who wanted to show the rest of America that there was much more to be said. One such collection, edited by Meredith McCarroll and Tony Harkins, assembled essays, photography, and poetry by Appalachians who took issue with the claims. When Vance declared his candidacy, social media lit up with advice about what to read instead of Hillbilly Elegy if people wanted to know true Appalachia, and this book was at the top of every list I encountered. When I decided to talk about the word hillbilly, I knew that McCarroll and Harkins would be on my list of people to talk to, especially after my episode with Ashley York, director of Hillbilly, and especially because Tony Harkins wrote the book about Hillbilly called Hillbilly, A Cultural History of an American Icon. Tony is a professor of history at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and a scholar of U.S. popular culture history, particularly representations of rural America. In addition to the book Hillbilly, he is co-editor with Meredith McCarroll of Appalachian Reckoning, a region response to Hillbilly Elegy, which expresses the complexities and possibilities of contemporary Appalachia through scholarship, narrative essay, photography, and poetry. Meredith McCarroll teaches college writing at the University of Southern Maine. She's taught first-year writing, American literature, film, African American literature, and Southern literature at Bowdoin College, Clemson University, Northeastern University. She served as director of writing and rhetoric for nearly a decade, is core faculty teaching nonfiction at West Virginia Wesleyan College's MFA program, and frequently teaches courses with the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. So welcome to the podcast, Tony and Meredith.
I want to start by saying that I'm so pleased, even if it's over Zoom, to meet both of you because I've read your work and heard so much about you over the years in my studies. And so it's great to have you on the podcast. And thank you for joining me today. It's a really interesting time that we're in right now. And your book is sort of at the center of that again. And so I thought it would be a timely conversation for us to have. So if we're talking to an audience of people both inside and outside the region, I think it would be good to explore the difference between what mainstream America thinks a hillbilly is and the way that people who identify with that word, what they think about it. You know, Dolly Parton, whom we all love, calls herself a hillbilly. But I don't know that that's the kind of hillbilly JD Vance is claiming. Can you just start us off by grounding us in that word hillbilly?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very vexed term, and it's very much dependent upon whether you're using it to define yourself and people you know, or you're using it to define others and others you don't know, right? And so I think I think it means community to a lot of people. It's just the people they were raised around, and they have a sense of pride in being part of that community, being close to the land where they are and the history of that place, a sense of shared identity through struggle. I think that's very much part of calling oneself a hillbilly, is the idea that you have had a life of struggle and that you have overcome those struggles through collective, effort. I think the national conception of it is very, very fluid. It can be whatever you kind of want it to be, but it generally associates with the South and the upland South. I think Appalachians think of themselves as kind of the only uniquely hillbilly, but I mean, it's very much part of the Ozark identity. It can be part of Louisiana. It can be framed how you want, even upstate Washington, in the Egg and I. So so geographically, it's very fluid, but I think it has to do with the upland South, and it usually has to do with the conception of people who are in the lower classes, either poor or off the grid somehow, outside of the economic power structure, and who are also a mix of sort of positive and negative elements. So positively, they can be connected to the frontier, to the pioneers, to the sense of sort of self-reliance, of being able to survive whatever conditions you're faced with, sense of community and family and place, that you are of somewhere, and you know where you're from and you know who you are, that sort of thing. But negatively, kind of the flip side of all of that is that you are backwards, you are ignorant, you are primitive, you are unable to sort of pull yourself up and move on. The idea that, the solution is U-Haul, that you're not wise enough to understand that you're aberrant in various ways. And also, I think that you're white. I mean, I think it is a term of whiteness. And because of that, it's a kind of way to talk about race without talking about race. And I think that's absolutely what J.D. Vance does. To talk about hillbillies is a way to sort of universalize whiteness, and also say, you see, I'm not a white nationalist or whatever, because I have critiques of white people as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think it's very fluid in that way, and I think it's a term used to justify exploitation, control, and inequality.
It's hard to add much to what Tony Harkins has to say about the word hillbilly, because he has, spent so much time and has literally written the book on it. I will just say that I spent a couple of weeks back in my hometown this past month. And one thing that struck me, I took my son to a high school football game at the high school that I graduated from. I was like, oh, right. Like all of these cheers talked about hillbillies. Our mascot is the Mountaineer. I then went to Appalachian State University, where the mascot was also the Mountaineer. So I grew up with this image of a Mountaineer and a hillbilly as a figure in the way that mascots are figures, right? Like this wasn't when I was growing up in the mountains of North Carolina. I don't remember very many people claiming hillbilly identity. It was more of kind of this caricature, and it was like people use the term redneck as a marker of class and all kinds of other things. And that was a word that I heard people like say to one another, and that some people claimed. But hillbilly really wasn't something that I heard at the time. And I noticed, I was at my 30th high school reunion just this month, and people were using hillbilly as like they were reclaiming it in a way that we weren't doing 30 years ago. So it's curious to me why that term has continued to evolve and shift and become something that people claim a little bit more. And I think it is, just to agree with Tony, that the way that people were talking about it was both in this context of like, why we love the place that we're from so much, and that it's like this simple way of living where, classmates were just talking about how all they really need is to wake up in the morning and watch the fog lift off the valley in front of them. And they were like, if that makes me a hillbilly, okay. Or if that makes me an old man, okay. So it was like this kind of positive, there was this fluidity around the way that people were using it. And then I was back in the area following the hurricane and the flooding, which hit my hometown really hard. And there were a lot of people using hillbilly strong as this way of exactly also what you're talking about, Tony. Like, we've gone through something hard, and because we know how to manage this, we're going to be fine. And so, yeah, that's kind of my recent experience thinking about that word.
That's how I've heard it used around here, was the resilience and the strength and the family. Appalachian Reckoning was a response, which I read it when it first came out, and then I reread it again in preparation for this episode. But I want to say first that I have co-edited a book, and I know what a feat that is. I know how hard that is to bring so many people together, and especially with a topic. Mine was on Appalachian dialect, so it was pretty contentious, especially on a topic where people have so many different opinions. So it's really it's so well done, and congratulations to both of you, because it's also, I think, something that's perennial. It's always gonna serve us in these conversations, and that's great. So the problem with Vance's book that so many people have, because when I read these threads, when people are discussing this, I see some people go, I don't get it. It was a good story. I don't understand why people are having such a problem with it. We're worried that America already has this idea of us burned into our brains about who hillbillies are. And we hope over the years we've made progress in showing how much more complex we are, right? Diverse, and so forth. And we're worried that Vance's book, as popular as it was, might set us back because he goes from his personal memoir to his own argument that Appalachians caused their problems. That's the primary theme I see in Appalachian Reckoning. Hutton writes in your book that he ignores the larger socioeconomic factors that contributed to the region's problems, erasing broader historical forces and explanations. So I'm thinking of drug companies, for example, because Barbara Kingsolver's novel, Demon Copperhead, talks about this. We know that drug companies, we know for sure that they targeted certain areas of Appalachia. They targeted doctors and pharmacists. And if you can't trust your doctor or your pharmacist, who can you trust? And so that's a perfect example of why it wasn't our fault. What does the book mean now? When he declared his candidacy, everybody came out with lists. Read these books instead of that book, right? And yours was at the very top of every list that I saw, which must have felt good.
Sort of. I wish that instead we were talking about all the great writers in Appalachian Reckoning and all of the diversity of voices. But in reality, the reason that Appalachian Reckoning is back on people's minds is because in some ways what we feared was true. I think that you're right, Amy, that a lot of people, when Hillbilly Elegy came out, so many people said, I mean, what's the big deal? It's just his story. Like, you can't tell him that that's not his story. And so I think that Tony and I and a lot of the writers in the book were working really hard to thread this needle to explain that, of course, people have the right to tell their own story, but there really is, and you already pointed to it, this pivot that happens where he moves from I to we, and he becomes kind of a spokesperson for the region. And what he's saying about the region also was really upsetting to a lot of people within the region, that he is, blaming the victim. It's a disguise. I would say it is a political book disguised as a memoir. And I think that we realized that he was launching himself. I don't think we predicted that it would be this far, but I think a lot of us saw, oh, he is using the region, he is using his story for political gain. And that's why we wanted people to pay attention to the careful way that he was spinning his story. And so today, on a really simple level, it is is evidence that our what people might have thought was our overreaction was unfortunately valid. That we saw that he was willing to use his experience and spin it in a way to gain power.
Did people think you were overreacting? They did?
Yeah, I think there was some of that at the time. And honestly, I think I personally was clearly way underreacting. I mean, I gave him much more of a benefit of the doubt than, I mean, what Meredith is saying is, I read Silas House and he said, I knew from the minute I read that it's about launching, his career and all of that. And I didn't really, because of course, remember, he's a never Trumper at that point. And that's what made his book his book. I mean, if he had been a Trumpite, nobody would have, the whole liberal media would not have, and liberal punditry would not have taken it seriously. It's because he was supposedly this neutral figure. I mean, I think that's the other thing is he presents his story and his sort of assessment of where things are as a neutral one based on personal biography. When, as Meredith says, it's a political one that is not neutral at all. And but because he at least framed himself, I think I think he's following power. But when that changed, when that, flipped, then he's happy to flip too. So I think that's the problem with it is that it was always sort of self-motivated and also, as we say in the intro of our book, his bona fides comes from his connection to power. So it wasn't that he was a hillbilly, quote unquote, that gave him that he was the true voice. It was that he was connected to Amy Schwa and Peter Thiel and Random House, whatever, published it. And that's what made him legitimate voice of this region, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, we can take him seriously because he went to Yale and everything. And so therefore, he can be someone credible and has something to say, and then sort of suggests that people in the region, from the region, don't really have something to say, can't really speak articulately enough to be listened to, right? I think, if anything, the more this happened, when he started running for Senate in Ohio, I realized that, this was always part of the plan.
So let's talk about Appalachian Reckoning and the great writers in this book. Because you put together a book, you combined essays and creative work. You invited all different genres and different voices. Talk about why you did that. Talking about.
It was just I don't know what the opposite of a perfect storm is, a perfect dawn or something, but everything came together kind of organically, but not intentionally. So initially it was just supposed to be kind of two different projects. Meredith was working on a project, and you can speak to that, of Appalachian writers, and I was working on a project of coming out of a conference session at ASA, Appalachian Studies Association, where I just saw this book blowing up, and I was like, well, Appalachian Studies must be interested in that, and there must be a lot of, and I realized all these people were writing about it, and I said, well, this conference should absolutely take this on and assess it. And out of that came an offer to do a book drawing from that initial panel, but it was probably not quite enough and also kind of, starting to be repetitive. And then Meredith comes into the picture.
Yeah. So while Tony was focused on collecting these voices, because there was so much great writing that did come out, either debunking or complicating Hillbilly Elegy. So Tony was working on pulling those together. And at the same time, I had been approached to create a collection of Appalachian writers talking about accent. People like you, Amy, have already written books like that, which doesn't mean that wasn't a valid approach. But I was collecting these pieces, and I had beautiful pieces of writing, but it was like the whole was not greater than the sum of its parts. It was not, I was just like, I don't know what's holding this together. And so I went to the editor at West Virginia University Press and said, this just isn't adding up. There needs to be, it's like there just needs to be something connective. And Tony had talked with him around the same time. And I think Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, but he said something like, it is getting repetitive and there's not really like a heart to this. And this editor, Andrew Brzezinski, had this idea to get us on the phone together. And at this point, Tony and I really didn't know one another. We had met once. I was a super fan because I had read Hillbilly and had written a lot drawn from that book. And so when I realized like, oh, I'm going to be in conversation with Tony Harkins about this potential collaboration, I was, excited, but also a little bit nervous. But Andrew Brzezinski, I think, deserves a lot of credit because he heard the two of us having these projects that just felt like they were missing something, and he had the idea to bring them together. And so that's what led to this book in multiple parts. The first is responding to Hillbilly Elegy, and then the second is beyond Hillbilly Elegy. And then I think from there, collaboratively, we saw more pieces and had the idea to bring in photography and poetry and to really expand it into something that really was, I think, bigger and better than either of the two projects alone.
When you examine any topic, you have the scholarship and the research that you can put forward, but you can give research and scholarship all day long about dialects, but you also have to have the personal interpretation of what it means to speak it, right? And so that's what I think that the creative pieces bring into that is just another lens to say it's one thing to talk about us, who we are and everything statistically and seed it with seminal works about Appalachia, but it's really important to understand the personal side of it as well. I think that adds a lot. And you talk in your personal essay about accent.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask you about that. You talked about the pronunciation of on, O-N,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which for many of, a lot of us pronounce it that way. And when you heard Silas House use that pronunciation in a speech, you wrote, "The ground shifted beneath your feet." He said on and on and on, right? And you said, "I want to claim the voices belonging to my people." So many of us have that story. I'm in season 2 of the podcast now, and I've talked to many authors who, Crystal Wilkinson and Silas House, and they've all talked about this shift that had to take place at some point where you grow up a little bit self-conscious about it because you know how different it is, especially when you travel. Maybe you erase it, maybe you run away from it, and then at some point you come back.
Yeah.
You come back.
You're lucky.
Yeah, if you're lucky. That was your point, right? Hearing Silas, was that your point, or did it take longer?
That was a huge shift for me because I think at that point I was living in South Carolina where it would seem that I should have been comfortable using my accent, but I had lived in Boston, I had lived different places, and I really had repressed it so much. And I didn't know how to be in an academic space and talk the way I talked at home. That was really what it was for me, was that it was like major, major code switching, but to the point that I could never quite get back into, and I still have lost like certain parts of my accent that I'll never be able to get back. But I think that what was so crucial was that I was in this academic space. I was at the Appalachian Studies Association conference, which is such an incredible coming together of scholars who are like top notch, just incredibly smart people, next to activists and practitioners and artists and musicians. It's just like this incredible space that is filled with so many different types of thinkers and makers. But it's an academic space. I mean, I was there to give an academic paper, and Silas House was the keynote speaker. And he was speaking about calling out Appalachian scholars and the people at this conference to be advocates for the LGBTQ community. And so that's what he was talking about. And it was already emotional because of the context. But yeah, I had never heard Silas speak. I had only read his work. And so hearing him in this very academic space say own and own and own, and in addition to all the other ways that he speaks with accented English, yeah, it just was like I didn't realize that could happen, that you could be progressive in an intellectual space and use that was like for me the one word that I had worked so hard to get rid of, and that I would slip up and say like it's still hard for me because I'll say, when I mean to say a room of one's own, I would say a room of one's on, because I had like so erased own from my vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
So I had really repressed that so much. And just to hear him claim that and speak in that way really was a big shift for me. And then I think it is continuing work to reclaim the accent that I repressed. And it comes and goes, and it's still hard in academic spaces to show up with that accent, to be honest.
Especially if you don't work in Appalachia, especially, I mean, I work at a college in Central Appalachia, and so a lot of people sound like me, right?
Mhm.
So it's not, I imagine, not as difficult as being somewhere like Boston.
Yeah, absolutely. I live in Portland, Maine, and nobody talks like me here. And so I'm aware of it, and I'm trying to find ways to own the fact that that is like such a positive thing, that it's a strength.
It also is kind of instant authenticity and instant credibility in certain ways, right? I mean, when you because it is a product of your upbringing and your whole life, and so there's a way in which I always feel kind of as an outsider, because I do not have, and I'm not from the region, and I do not have that accent, and so I'm kind of cognizant of the opposite. And so it's in the context, but obviously the context of academic or business advancement, or media advancement is dependent upon not being, not seeming otherized, right? So, I mean, there's obviously ways in which, it's sort of like the idea of code switching, I guess, and maybe that's a way to think about it, is that there is positivity to it, but it can also be a skill to know what to make public and what not to make public, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not to erase it internally inside yourself, of course, but to understand that different contexts have different, depending on your motivations. And, once you reach the point of Silas House, you don't have to worry about that anymore. And of course, that is what gives him, his authenticity and credibility to a world that doesn't know him as well. So
Right.
it can be both. It can go both ways.
That code switching makes me think a little bit about, like, in the world of linguistics, it's complicated. Like, I think about this scholar, Vershawn Ashanti Young, who, instead of code switching, he says that code switching is still a privileging of the way you speak at school, right? And that you can talk the way you want to at home, but that's definitely othered. And so he advocates for this idea of code meshing. Yeah.
I knew that's where you were going.
Yep. And maybe that's what I should keep striving toward. And I do think that that's probably a little bit more what I do now, I hope. But I like that idea of bringing it into spaces where you don't expect it.
Yeah. Bell Hooks code meshed in her writing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally.
Yeah, she totally did. I just think she's a good example of that. And there's some people that say we can't switch one off and put one on, that it's not possible, that they always overlap somehow.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had heard that term. And I think it's a very personal decision. It's a personal decision that people have to make. When I work with teachers, I say, that's why that's why we teach code switching instead of, this is wrong, this is right.
Right.
You have some writers in Appalachian Reckoning that give voice to the other side of this argument, who say, let people write their personal stories. They're valid too. People tend to cherry pick who they want to accuse of being an outsider and an insider. And I think that's good, because you obviously give balance, right, to this, and you give people a voice who have an opinion. What do you say, though, to writers, whether they're inside Appalachia, outside Appalachia, who want to write about the region and say, it's my story?
Yeah.
If you were in a writing workshop with people who want to write about Appalachia, what would you tell them?
I do a lot of teaching of memoir writing and nonfiction writing. And I guess the main thing is, it has to be true. It has to be true to you in a deep way. You have to know why you're telling a particular story. And I think if you're writing about I was going to say, if you're writing about a group that might be sensitive, I don't know what group wouldn't be sensitive, but like if you're writing about a region like Appalachia that has been misrepresented for so long, then I think you have to know why you are telling the stories that you're telling. And you just have to be honest with yourself about that. And again, I think that what J.D. Vance does in the first half of his book, he has every right to do. I'm not in the camp that says he doesn't count as Appalachian because his family moved away. I mean, the outmigration in Appalachia, that's a huge part of Appalachian history. So
Mhm.
to me, I agree with Kelly Hansel Hayward, who's in our book with a piece called In Defense of J.D. Vance. Part of what she takes issue with is some people want to discredit him and say he isn't Appalachian enough. And that to me is focusing on the wrong thing. I mean, I think that he definitely is an out migrant from Appalachia and has those ties that to me validate his Appalachian connections and his upbringing. I would say that what he's doing in the first half of the book, he has every right to do. Again, it's really just that shift where he's making generalizations that is dangerous. And so anyone wanting to write about the region, I would say the same warning should go to them to tell your story, tell your true story, but be aware that it's slippery to make generalizations. It's an easy thing to do. And so just be aware of that, which is what I would say about someone writing about any place or any group of people. That's just kind of good memoir writing.
Mm-hmm.
As a historian, I would say the other thing he does is he erases everything around, which led to or which impacted his family and his conditions. I mean, he doesn't erase it utterly, but he erases it largely. And we are all products of a larger world, right? We didn't fall out of a coconut tree, right? And so that social, economic, political context matters as well, right? So particularly if you're going to say, here's my story and here's how it connects to some bigger story, then that bigger story has to be told in its completeness. I think it's fine to say, here's my family history, and this is just what happened inside of our family. And sure, we were shaped by these other things, but that's not what I'm concerned about. But if you're going to say this is somehow a lesson about something for somebody, then you have to put it into its broader context, or else you're distorting that truth, So your internal, and I think people have an internal truth where they do not, on a daily basis, think about the socioeconomic conditions that have shaped them and their community and don't even know about it. But that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. That doesn't mean it hasn't, been that force. And so obviously being part of an Appalachian diaspora is part of, those things happen for very explicit economic, political, social reasons. So that's the other part, I guess, is the problem with J.D. Vance's approach is to sort of erase that, to be kind of also anti-intellectual about it, to sort of discount scholarship that is valuable to understand this history. So that he says ridiculous things about like how Bloody Breath it gets named and stuff like that. And that's a problem as well, right?
And I think that was why there was such a response initially from scholars of Appalachia, was that we have shelves filled with books of history and sociology that tell us the story of all of these shifts in Appalachia that help us understand. Anyone who's really studied Appalachian history understands the opioid crisis as a part of a larger, a series of extractive industries, that it is tied to that. And the fact that he isn't looking at that history and is drawing some, frankly, just incorrect conclusions, that was, I think, irritating to people who know that history. But what really did it for most people, I think, was when suddenly the mainstream and the liberal media were upholding, they were holding this book up as representative of the region, and it was discrediting all of the work that is ignored in in his version of Appalachian history. I mean, my experience with the book was that I was living in Maine, and I was very proud of being Appalachian, and that was a lot of what I was writing about and talking about, and people knew me as Appalachian. And I think most people didn't know Appalachia, right? And then when this book, Hillbilly Elegy, came out, I had so many really intelligent colleagues say, "Oh, I read Hillbilly Elegy, and so now I kind of get where you're from." That was what made me go and read the book. And then I was like, "Oh my God, that you don't get where I'm from at all. You get this one person's story, and then there's a huge gap." And so I think that was why so many people wanted to fill that void that had been created to bridge that gap between his story and the story of Appalachia.
So, is there anything I haven't asked you about that you would like to talk about regarding Appalachian Reckoning or the work you're doing now?
I just wanted to hear from Meredith and from you about how the hurricane, what you think the hurricane's not just economic impact, but, psychological, emotional impact will be. And the state of devastation is just beyond imagining. And it is starting to become 60 Minutes did the piece last night, and I don't know if you saw it, but it is very much part of sort of becoming part of consciousness and becoming part of what being a Appalachian means in some ways. Since Meredith has, been on the ground intensely recently.
I've been trying to write my way toward understanding about, this is my third 1,000-year flood in 3 years.
Right. That's the other part.
And this is just going to be the case for everybody. Like, this is not just me. And so I'm trying to make sense of what it means just in terms of like a planet in climate crisis, but also in terms of how this specifically affects Appalachia. And I haven't fully wrapped my head around it yet, but I will say that I found myself writing a phrase yesterday, and I thought, oh, I've written this before. And what I wrote was something like, every once in a while, America remembers that Appalachia exists. And that is a phrase taken from this piece that I published with Bitter Southerner about the Appalachian Reckoning and about Hillbilly Elegy. And it is a moment that Appalachia is on the national radar again. And what is striking me right now is, sometimes it's politics and right now it's climate. But I want to just make clear to everyone, this is not specific to Appalachia. Like, Appalachia is, in terms of like the politically, it's so often been the scapegoat for the rest of the country. And right now, I feel that that's happening a little bit. Like, people imagine that this will only happen in places that don't have a particular infrastructure. And I'm just like, I live in a place that had never flooded before, and it's devastated now. Like, towns are gone. Like, things are changing. And the way that people responded in the 2016 election to the election of Trump was a little bit like, yeah, but people kind of were asking for this. Like, if you're going to vote for Trump, then you have this coming. And then thankfully people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and many others complicated that narrative that that's not really who was electing Trump. Right now, there's a similar feeling that I have, which is wanting to complicate and set the record straight that there's nothing that anyone in Appalachia did to deserve these floods. And they're coming everywhere. They're going to be everywhere. The climate is just changing. And I still feel like people are talking about Florida and Appalachia as these places that floods happen and not understanding them in this larger context.
Right.
So it's not quite connected in my brain, but I'm seeing this pattern of representing the region as somehow deserving of what's happening there. Total misunderstanding of what it means to be deeply from a place, and just who has the who's in a financial situation to be able to just leave.
I never imagined a hurricane would ever do what it did this far north.
Yes.
Yeah.
I never imagined that. And I don't think people did.
I mean, I would say from Meredith that there is a growing, I mean, I'm hearing it more and more from people, which is like, where is it safe? So that the idea that there is no safe zone, that if a hurricane can go 600 miles and devastate a place, that, not to the extent that we're going to make it an issue, we're going to make it a political issue, but, I think there is a real sense of anxiety in that way. On the other hand, I think there's also a sense that, well, because it was Appalachia, they were probably in bad shape to begin with. And, in some ways it was worse than it would have been other places. And in some ways that's true. And in some places that's not true. But, we have the poem Canary Dirge in the book. And I really think of that a lot. I think of that poem all the time. You were asking what things resonate with me, and that's one of them. Because this idea about, being the headwaters in all sorts of ways, both literally and also kind of conceptually, it's just shocking to me how little consciousness we are paying to climate change. Maybe that's just a coping mechanism or whatever, but it's not it only has one bad solution, a bad outcome.
Right. Well, I just want to say thank you again to you both for your time. This has been great.
Well, thank you so much for having us. This has been great to be able to return and talk about the book at this moment. And it's an honor to be on your podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Amy.